In 1937, an archaeological expedition into the Bayanhar Mountains uncovered something unbelievable, something otherworldly, a discovery so controversial that the debate surrounding it still continues to this day, because it might just prove the existence of intelligent life beyond our planet. Even decades after the infamous crash at Roswell took place, people still have no definitive answer as to what occurred that fateful day in New Mexico. Meanwhile, over in China, almost 10 years before the Roswell incident, a group of explorers stumbled onto the discovery of a lifetime, one that might finally put to rest the question of whether or not mankind is truly alone in the universe. This is the story of the Dropa stones, China's very own Roswell incident. Our story begins on the slopes of Bayankaraula, a mountain range in Qinghai province situated in the northwest. These mountains stand right on the border between China and neighboring Tibet. It was here that a Chinese professor, Chipute, was leading an expedition of fellow archaeologists that happened upon something that seemed to have been pulled straight from a science fiction story. Chipute and his team encountered a number of oddities while on their trek over the mountains, and curiosity compelled them to take a closer look. The first thing that the professor and his fellow explorers discovered was a series of graves aligned neatly in rows. Someone had been buried there. Now, you might jump to the assumption that these were what was left of another expedition, maybe one from years prior that predated Professor Chipute's own excursion into the Bayanhar Mountains. And why wouldn't you assume that? After all, venturing up those mountains can be very dangerous, especially for those underprepared or inexperienced with traversing that kind of terrain. But there were a few things off about these grave sites, to say the least. For one, they didn't seem to be large enough to contain the remains of an adult human. Could the archaeologists have happened upon children's remains? What could children have been doing at this altitude? And another thing, where was whoever had buried them? A burial site like this one didn't just appear out of nowhere after all. Someone had to have dug those graves, even if it meant there'd be nobody left to do the same for them. Yet, there were no other remains anywhere nearby. Either whoever was responsible had returned to civilization and never revealed what had happened, or ventured back out into the mountains to perish. Still, like any good archaeologist, Professor Chipute got to digging, and his team exhumed a number of skeletal remains. And that was when the next mystery revealed itself. The skeletons they uncovered were seemingly not human. When laid out flat, each of the skeletons only measured about 4 feet in height, hence the much shorter graves. But more curiously than that, their bodies were all frail and spindly, with their skulls looking unlike those of a human being. They definitely seemed to be of a humanoid shape, bipedal with 2 arms as well, but their heads were almost disproportionately large and overdeveloped. One of the members of the expedition team theorized that they had unknowingly stumbled upon a previously undiscovered species of mountain gorilla. But Professor Chipute reportedly asked, "Whoever heard of apes burying one another?" The team investigated the mountain further, eventually discovering a cave. Yet this too seemed to be unusual. The cave walls were glazed, almost as if the tunnels had been carved artificially using intense heat. Naturally, the team's curiosity was already piqued, and they ventured further. It was while exploring this that they discovered the cave was a part of an interlinked system, burrowing deep into the mountain. Inside one of the tunnels that branched off from the main one, Professor Chipute's team came across pictograms and cave paintings on the walls that depicted beings that seemed to be wearing large helmets. These images also portrayed celestial bodies like the sun, the moon, and the stars. Others showed mountains with lines of pea-sized dots that all connected the surface of the earth to the sky above. It was baffling, needless to say. What did all of this mean? What ancient civilization did these beings in the pictograms belong to? Were they somehow connected to the grave sites? All these questions remained unanswered, and the mystery only grew as the professor and his archaeological expedition made their most incredible discovery of all. Buried in the dirt floor of the caves was an odd stone disc. It was roughly 9 inches in diameter, carved out of stone 3/4 of an inch thick. Directly in the middle of the disc was a perfectly circular hole, with a groove that spiraled out from its central hole and reached across the surface of the disc all the way to its edge. It almost resembled some kind of ancient vinyl record. However, this was only the very first object of its kind that would be retrieved from the cave. Overall, the archaeologists found around 716 of these discs. Professor Chipute was said to have made a few astute observations about these strange artifacts upon their discovery. Sorry, we couldn't resist. First, the older of the preserved discs seems to be between 10,000 and 12,000 years old. By his educated estimate, the cave paintings they found were also somewhere around 12,000 years old, and this is hugely significant. It meant that these discs, whatever they were, predated even the oldest estimates of the ages of the Great Pyramids of Giza. His other interesting finding was the intricate level of detail on the discs themselves. Upon closer inspection, the professor noticed that the grooves weren't simply carved lines on the granite surface of the discs, but actually seemed to be hieroglyphs that were nearly microscopically small. But even though Professor Chipute couldn't decipher them, it told him that these stone discs obviously had to have been fashioned by the hands of some intelligent creature. Interestingly, he was hesitant to say that they'd been made by human hands, although academics haven't reached a consensus on this to this day. So, what happened next? Well, the expedition's findings were said to be gathered up and then just stored away. They were supposedly labeled and kept at Beijing University, but neither Professor Chipute made any attempts at deciphering the hieroglyphs that had been carved into the stone discs, or at the very least, any attempts that were made were completely unsuccessful for over 2 decades. Interestingly enough, the Beijing University mentioned does not actually exist as a standalone entity, so the reports could have been misinterpreting the name of Peking University, one of the biggest universities in Beijing, as Beijing University due to its location. Then in 1958, another professor named Dr. Nui entered the story when some of those discs were given to him for study he was conducting. Much like Professor Chipute had noticed before, the grooves in each of the discs actually consisted of a series of tiny hieroglyphs of an unknown origin. These glyphs were indeed so small and intricate that Dr. Tsum needed a magnifying glass in order to see them in their entirety. Deciphering them wasn't going to be easy though. Many of the tiny symbols had been eroded over time, rendering them not entirely legible. Nonetheless, Dr. Tsum was fascinated. The hieroglyphs weren't in any pattern consistent with the others that had been discovered by earlier archaeologists, and compelled to understand more, he continued to study them. It was at some point around this time that he seemed to have cracked the code behind the stone discs and their meaning, and became completely captivated by them. Dr. Tsum had to find out more, and every new glyph that he decoded led to further discoveries, the likes of which had never been made before. He even called the carved lines on the discs the speaking grooves, given how much he was able to learn from them. But the implications of what he had realized by studying the discs were so world-shattering that he was forced to keep his findings secret, save for a select few that he trusted. As far as the outside world was concerned though, Nui felt that nobody else was ready for what he had just uncovered by studying these mysterious discs. After 4 years of intense study of the discs, Dr. Nui allegedly managed to piece together the full story told by the hieroglyphic characters etched on the stones. He was even able to give them a name as a result, and henceforth they became known as the Dropa stones. The word Dropa, also sometimes spelled as DZOPA, DZHOPA, DROPAS, or DROP-KA, was derived from the name of a nomadic group that lived within the Tibetan mountains, the Dropka. These nomads were, as categorized by some anthropologists, neither Chinese nor Tibetan. However, at least according to Dr. Tsum, they might have originated from much further away. He believed that the Dropa were of shorter pygmy stature, with an average height of around 4 feet, and they had thin bodies with larger heads. Having spent all that time deciphering the glyphs on the Dropa stones, Dr. Tsum had supposedly read a truly incredible story. He claimed that the hieroglyphs told of a craft of unknown origin that had crash-landed in the area of the Bayanhar mountain range where Professor Chipute and his expedition had first discovered the cave system. According to Dr. Tsum's findings, the craft that had crashed hadn't just been responsible for leaving behind these mysterious caves, but also, according to his understanding of the Dropa stones, contained the Dropa people. Dr. Tsum claimed that one of the discs had apparently said, "The Dropa came down from the clouds in their aircraft. Our men, women, and children hid in the caves 10 times before sunrise." Apparently, once the Dropa realized they were unable to repair their craft that they had arrived in, they were forced to stay in the area and faced the perils of the remote mountain range that they had landed in. While exploring, the Dropa sought refuge in the caves situated around the Bayanhar Mountains. However, they then ended up crossing paths with another tribe from the local region, known as the Ham, who were occupying some of the neighboring caves. Afraid of those strange visitors, despite them apparently being peaceful, the Ham initially attacked the Dropa and were even able to kill a number of them. That would certainly also explain the strange burial site that Professor Chipute and his team found when they explored the Bayanhar range. Eventually, as Sum-Umnui's readings of the stones said, when at last we understood the sign language of the Dropa, we realized that the newcomers had peaceful intentions. Also, according to Dr. Sum, another section of the stone story went into the regret that the Han people had over being so quick to attack these newcomers, and that they had tried to assist the Dropa in building a new craft in order to help them return to their home. But it seemed that they weren't able to achieve this. Obviously, that's a pretty wild claim to make. Dr. Sum's report was allegedly published in a professional archaeology journal when he made his findings public in 1962. In response, he and his translation of the stones was subsequently ridiculed. Dr. Sum was met with such disbelief that he decided to leave China altogether. He went into self-imposed exile in Japan, where he died not long after he completed a manuscript that detailed his supposed discoveries surrounding the Dropa stones. However, the Peking Academy of Prehistory allegedly refused to allow Sum to publish his findings anywhere and forbade him from speaking about them again. But that wouldn't be the end of people's interest in the Dropa stones. A few years went by, and in 1966, the story regarding the stones drew the attention of a Russian reporter, W. Zaitsev. He discovered and then republished Sum-Umnui's findings, and eventually sought to requisition the discs in order to conduct some investigations of his own. He was able to get several of the Dropa stones shipped over to Moscow, thanks to a request made by researchers on behalf of the Soviet Union. Running numerous tests on the Dropa stones, Zaitsev learned that while they appeared to be ordinary granite, the stone discs had some rather peculiar properties to them. According to Zaitsev's analysis, the granite that the Dropa stones were made from contained unusually high concentrations of metals, specifically cobalt, among others. Lots of stones contain traces of other minerals, of course, but what was significant about this discovery was that it meant the stone would have been so dense and hard that any primitive culture would have found it incredibly difficult to carve anything into them with the limited tools available at the time. Yet the hieroglyphs that had been etched into the Dropa stones, which don't forget were so small they needed to be magnified to be studied, held such minute detail that it seemed impossible that anyone could have carved something so intricate so long ago, unless they were using a method other than those used by primitive humans. But that wasn't all. Zaitsev also discovered that thanks to the presence of the metals within the Dropa stones, they could function as electrical conductors. During testing, he placed one of the discs on an oscillograph, and it recorded a surprising rhythm once the stone had been electrically charged. It also began to produce a strange humming sound. Nothing more seemed to happen with the Dropa stones for a while. Then, in 1974, while on a visit to the Banpo Museum in Xi'an within the Shanxi province, an Austrian engineer, Ernst Vergerer, was permitted to view a couple of Dropa stones on display. According to some sources, he asked the museum's manager about the purpose of the strange stone discs. The manager wasn't able to provide him with any useful information, but did permit Vergerer to take some photographs of the discs. Strangely, in his photos, the hieroglyphs couldn't be properly seen. This could have just been because of how small they were, but Vergerer also pointed out that the flash from his camera had also obscured them, as had more natural deterioration. After all, by this point, it had been nearly 4 decades since they first had been found, and the stones were thought to be several thousand years old upon discovery. Then, in 1994, another 20 years later, 2 German scientists, Hartwig Hausdorff and Peter Krause, also made a visit to China and headed to the Banpo Museum. Once there, they inquired about the Dropa stones, except now they were nowhere to be found, at least not on display anywhere accessible by the public. When they spoke to the museum's director, they learned that the discs had been destroyed and that the museum did not officially recognize their existence. Digging further, Hausdorff discovered that the Chinese government also had no record of a tribe called the Dropa in the area of Bayanhar, where they were reportedly from, nor anywhere else in China for that matter. Strangely, after 1994, there seemed to be little to no mention of the Dropa stones anywhere. You'd think that one or even a handful of them might show up somewhere. There were over 700 of them discovered. Either they'd all been thoroughly destroyed or kept secured somewhere where nobody could find them. This all seems pretty compelling, doesn't it? Even with the detractors and disbelievers out there, it's hard to deny evidence. Wait, there is evidence for these stones being real, right? There has to be. We're sure they've been on display at the museum somewhere around the world. Oh, they haven't? Not even once? Well, it must be because they're still being examined. Let's instead look at the people who first discovered the existence of the stones and, oh, none of them are real? Yeah, we got you guys. Psych! Extensive inquiries into the Dropa stones have revealed them to be little more than an elaborate hoax. As time has gone on, new permutations of the story have spread, adding new fictitious details about the stones, their discovery, their potential origins, and possible connection to extraterrestrial life. But rest assured, there's actually no such thing as the Dropa stones. By not real, we don't just mean that they aren't connected to extraterrestrials either. We mean that nobody can even prove that the artifacts themselves even exist. They're entirely fabricated. There are no verifiably real photographs of them, and the alleged alien artifacts have never been displayed in any museums, despite claims to the contrary that the Dropa stones had been shown at the Banpo Museum. Neither they nor any other museum in China has any record of the stone discs ever being put on display. Everything about the story, the archaeological expedition in 1937, and its findings were all made up for an article titled Hypotheses, Assumptions, and Guesses. Does the Trail Lead into Space? That was featured in a Russian magazine in 1960. 2 years later, a German magazine called Das Vegetarische Universum, which translates to the Vegetarian Universe, also ran the story. And over the course of the 1960s, it was translated, retold, and republished in obscure articles and newsletters. The story about these supposed Dropa stones was translated from Russian to German, then French, then back to Russian before, and eventually an English translation of the second Russian version made it into Sputnik, the Russian Digest. That was the Russian magazine we mentioned before, and yes, this was a purely sensationalist magazine similar to the USA's National Enquirer. So of course, they weren't all that concerned about featuring stories detailing things that weren't 100% provably real. Bad journalism sells magazines, Steve. Bad journalism sells magazines. Now, before you become incandescent with rage, it's important to ask a few big questions. First of all, why would anyone put in a great deal of effort to make up something like this? Well, there could be a number of reasons. As we just alluded to, it could simply have been to trick people into buying copies of the sensationalist magazines. The original story was thought to have been penned by two Russian men, Valentin Isakovich Rich and Mikhail Borisovya Chernenko. They were responsible for the original article, Hypotheses, Assumptions, and Guesses, Does the Trail Lead into Space?, which happened to appear in the current digest of the Russian press, a Russian-language newspaper that started being published in the United States as early as 1910. They made all the initial claims about aliens having visited Earth in the distant past and the traces of their arrival being uncovered centuries later by archaeologists. Oh, did we forget to mention it? Yeah, Professor Chipute never even existed. Not only are the Dropa stones not real, but there's no record that anyone by that name ever worked anywhere. Same goes for Dr. Tsum Nui, too. Neither of them even has a real Chinese name. According to some proponents of the Dropa stones actually being real, this is owing to Dr. Tsum having changed or translated his name after fleeing to Japan to escape from ridicule. There's no evidence to corroborate that story, and it doesn't explain the same discrepancy occurring with Chipute. Even if he was a real person, it seems next to impossible that Dr. Tsum could have somehow decoded an entire ancient language in 4 years. Real experts in the field dedicate their entire lives to understanding lost forms of language, entire lifetimes, often working in teams of linguists and requiring in-depth knowledge of other existing languages that'll link to the ancient ones. There are some truths sprinkled into this sensationalist story, however. There actually is a real tribe of people called the Dropka, spelled correctly, but they aren't aliens or in any way otherworldly. They're simply just a group of herders who live a nomadic lifestyle out in the Tibetan Plateau. And yes, they have completely normal heights and no disproportionately large skulls. And then that begs another question: why do people believe in obviously disprovable stories like this one, as well as all the other tall tales pertaining to alien encounters? Well, that's actually somewhat easy to determine. You see, it can be all too easy for us to find ourselves getting lost in stories like this one about the Dropa stones. Ultimately, that's because life here on Earth can be pretty existentially terrifying at times. None of us really know the answers to big questions, like what the meaning of life is, why we're here, and what it's all for. Entire schools of philosophy have arisen trying to determine what the correct answer is, but the truth is nobody really knows, and usually anyone who claims to have all the answers is just someone trying to sell you something. But human beings are drawn into stories like this one because of the romanticism and the simplicity that they offer. Sure, there might be less than zero evidence that the Dropa stones exist, but jumping to the hasty conclusion that aliens are out there in the stars is just one way that people can dismiss all those terrifying existential questions. Whatever the actual truth behind the numerous mysteries of the universe, and the occasional existential horror of existing within it, we should try at least to find comfort in the things we know for certain. Now check out Soviet Union declassified UFO encounters revealed, or watch this video instead.